We start in the winter of 1968 on a cold pier at the far eastern edge of the Soviet Union. The base is called Rybachy. It sits on the Kamchatka Peninsula, a long finger of volcanic rock and black sand reaching down from Siberia into the northern Pacific, so remote that for most of the 20th century it did not appear on civilian maps at all. In February, the wind there comes off the water carrying ice, and the snow does not so much fall as travel sideways, and the men who work on the pier wear so many layers that they move like something mechanical. Tied up at that pier is a submarine called K-129. She is what NATO analysts call a Gulf II class boat. Diesel and electric, not nuclear, which means she must surface or come shallow to run her engines and breathe. She's roughly 328 feet long. She's painted the flat, absorbing black that all submarines of that era wore, a black chosen not for beauty but for the way it swallows light. Inside her sail, standing upright like three enormous sealed bottles, are 3 ballistic missiles, each one carrying a nuclear warhead, each one aimed, in theory, at a city. She has already completed a patrol that year. She has already come home once. Her crew has already been given the brief, precious weeks of leave that submariners live for. And then, unexpectedly, the orders come again, another patrol, sooner than anyone expected. Some of the crew are pulled back from leave. Some of them are replacements, men who had never sailed on this particular boat before, brought aboard at the last moment to fill gaps. There is a photograph that survives from those final days. It is not a dramatic photograph. It is just a group of men on a deck, in heavy coats, squinting into a grey sky. Some of them are smiling, some of them are not. None of them look like men who are about to disappear from the world. Her captain is a career officer, experienced, respected, a man who had spent his adult life in steel corridors beneath the sea. His wife and children lived in the naval housing at Rybachy, in the way that families do at every naval base in every country, in apartments where everyone knows when a boat is leaving, and everyone pretends not to count the days until it is due back. On the 24th of February 1968, K-129 slipped her lines and went out into the Pacific. She was expected to sail east, out past the Kuril Islands, into the deep open water north of Hawaii, and take up a patrol station from which her missiles could reach the western coast of the United States. This was the arithmetic of that decade. Boats like her from both sides moved constantly through the deep holding position, waiting for an order that everyone hoped would never come. It was a strange kind of employment. Months of absolute boredom, wrapped around a single terrible possibility. She was required to report her position at regular intervals. A short burst transmission, encoded, sent up through the antenna when she came shallow, lasting only seconds, telling Moscow that she was where she was supposed to be, and that all was well. She made the first report. She crossed the line of longitude she was meant to cross, and she told them so. And then, sometime in the early March, the report stopped. Nobody knows the precise moment. That is one of the small, cold details of this story that never gets easier to sit with. There was no final message, no distress call, no emergency beacon, no burst of static. There was simply a scheduled report that did not arrive, and then another one, and then another one. At Rybachy, the staff waited. This was not immediately alarming. Radio conditions in the North Pacific are difficult. Equipment fails. A boat might miss a window for a dozen mundane reasons and report late with an apology. So they waited a day, and then 2, and then a week. By the middle of March, the Soviet Navy understood that something had happened. What followed was, at the time, the largest peacetime naval search operation the Soviet Union had ever mounted. Ships were pulled from other duties. Aircraft flew grid patterns hour after hour over a stretch of ocean so vast that describing it in numbers does not really help. Imagine an area larger than many countries, and imagine it being empty, and imagine flying over it at low altitude day after day, looking down at grey water, hoping to see something, an oil slick, a piece of debris, a raft, anything. The search was so large and so obvious and so uncharacteristically frantic that American intelligence noticed it almost immediately. That is worth sitting with for a moment. The Soviets did not announce that they had lost a submarine. They never did. But the sheer scale of what they were doing on the water was itself a message, readable from thousands of miles away, and what it said was simple. We have lost something, and we cannot find it. The ships searched for weeks. The aircraft flew until the crews were exhausted, and then, quietly, without ceremony, the search was called off. At Rebacci, the families were not told the truth. They were told very little at all. Some accounts describe wives being informed that their husbands were missing without explanation. Some describe a longer, crueler silence. In the years afterward there were rumours, whispered in naval housing, that the crew had defected, that they were alive somewhere, that they had betrayed the country. Families were quietly watched. Some careers stalled. Some children grew up under a shadow they did not understand and could not ask about. 98 men had gone into the Pacific and had not come out, and their country had no explanation to offer. And so, in the absence of an explanation, suspicion filled the space instead. That is where the story would have ended. A boat lost in deep water, in an ocean too big and too deep to search, in a decade when such things happened more often than any government wished to admit. Except that the Soviets were wrong about one thing. The submarine was not unfindable. It had already been found. Let me take you somewhere else now. Somewhere warm and dry and quiet, thousands of miles from that cold grey search. Imagine a low building on a coastline. It has no signage. It has a fence and a gate and a guard, and beyond that rooms full of equipment that hums gently at all hours. There are men inside wearing headphones, sitting at consoles, watching paper move slowly beneath styluses that trace thin, dark lines. It is the middle of the night, and it is always the middle of the night in a room like this, because the ocean does not keep office hours. This is a shore station for a system called SOSUS, the Sound Surveillance System. Here is the thing about the ocean that people rarely appreciate until they are told. The ocean is not silent. The ocean is loud. It is a vast, layered, endlessly talkative acoustic environment, and it carries sound extraordinarily well, better than air, much better than air, and at a certain depth, in a layer of water where temperature and pressure balance in a particular way, sound becomes trapped, bending back on itself instead of escaping to the surface or the bottom, travelling along that layer like light down a fibre optic cable. Scientists call it the deep sound channel. A noise made in that channel can travel for thousands of miles before it fades. Beginning in the 1950s, the United States quietly laid hydrophones along the seafloor of both oceans, wired them back to shore stations, and began listening. The purpose was to track Soviet submarines. It worked extraordinarily well, well enough that for decades its very existence was among the most closely guarded secrets in the American arsenal. And because the system listened constantly, it also recorded things it was not looking for. Earthquakes, volcanic vents, the songs of whales, the groan of ice shelves carving thousands of miles away. And, in March of 1968, an event. The analysts did not know what it was at the time. They knew only that something had happened out in the deep water, something that produced a distinct acoustic signature at a specific moment on a specific day, at a location that could be worked out by comparing the arrival times of the sound at different listening posts. This is the same principle used to locate an earthquake. If you know when the sound reached 3 separate points, and you know how fast sound travels in that medium, mathematics will give you the origin. The mathematics gave them a point in the open Pacific, roughly 1,500 miles northwest of Hawaii. And when American analysts overlaid that point on what they were seeing of the frantic Soviet search, the picture assembled itself. The Soviets were looking in the wrong place. The Americans knew the right one. This is documented history. This is the part that is real, and it is remarkable enough on its own. a superpower lost a nuclear-armed submarine, searched for it with everything it had, and failed, while its adversary sat quietly on the other side of the world and knew, to within a few miles, exactly where the wreck was lying. Now here is where the conspiracy theory begins. According to the story, and I want to be clear that this is the story and not the record, the acoustic event that the listening stations captured that day was not what anyone expected it to be. There were sounds that made sense. Analysts of that era knew what a submarine sounded like when it died. They had a grim library of it. A hull failing under pressure has a signature, a sharp, violent collapse as the steel gives way all at once. A battery explosion has a signature. A torpedo detonation has a signature. These are known things, unpleasant but familiar, and an experienced analyst could recognise them the way a doctor recognises a heartbeat. The theory says that what was recorded that day did not match any of them. It says that before the collapse, before the silence, the hydrophones picked up something else. A tone. Sustained. Steady. Holding a single frequency for far longer than any natural event should, and then shifting cleanly to another frequency, and holding that one too. In the version of the story that circulates, an analyst wrote a note in the margin of the paper trace. The note is quoted in the conspiracy literature, though no such document has ever been produced, and you should hold it in your mind as exactly what it is, which is a story about a document rather than a document. Almost mechanical, the note supposedly reads, but not from the submarine. The trace was pulled, the event was reclassified, the men who had been on duty that night were reassigned separately to different stations, and the matter was not discussed again. Let that settle for a moment, and then let it go, because we have a long way still to travel tonight, and we are only just beginning our descent. What happened next is real again, and it is one of my favourite pieces of Cold War history precisely because it sounds invented. The United States decided to go and look. The vessel they sent was a submarine called the Halibut. She had been built in the 1950s for an entirely different purpose, as a launch platform for a cruise missile system that had been rendered obsolete almost as soon as it entered service. That obsolescence left the Navy with a nuclear submarine that had an enormous empty hangar built into her bow, a great hollow cavern where missiles used to live. Someone realised that an enormous empty space inside a submarine is not a problem, it is an opportunity. The Halibut was rebuilt into something new, something for which there was not really a word yet. She was fitted with side thrusters so that she could hover and creep. She was fitted with anchors so that she could hold position in the deep. And into that empty hangar went reels of cable, and a control room full of monitors, and a device the crew came to call the Fish. The Fish was a towed body about 12 feet long, packed with lights, sonar and cameras. It was lowered on cable through the hangar door and dragged slowly above the sea floor, sending back images from a depth no human had ever visited and no diver could ever reach. It was, in effect, a robot. In 1968, operating 3 miles down. The Halibut sailed out to the coordinates that the listening stations had produced, and she began to search. I want you to understand what that search was actually like, because it was nothing like the movies. The area to be covered was still enormous. The Fish moved slowly, because it had to, because the cable and the currents and the pressure allowed nothing else. It ran film, actual photographic film, tens of thousands of frames, which could not be reviewed until the film was developed aboard the submarine in a makeshift darkroom. So the process went like this. Tow the Fish for hours, recover it, develop the film, look at the pictures, see nothing. Move to the next section of the grid, do it again. They did that for weeks. The crew slept in shifts in a boat that smelled of amines and diesel and developing chemicals. They ate the same meals in the same order. They ran the same grid lines, and every time the film came out of the tank there was a moment of hope, and then the pictures showed mud, and only mud, and the flat, featureless plain of a sea floor that had been undisturbed since before anything walked on land. Somewhere in the summer of 1968, a frame came up different. There was a shape on it, a long, dark, artificial shape, resting on the sediment, with a line of disturbed bottom stretching away from it where it had struck and slid. They had found K129. The film that followed is one of the most extraordinary intelligence hauls of the entire Cold War. Thousands upon thousands of photographs of the wreck from every angle at close range, in perfect black water lit by the fish's own lamps. Photographs of the hull, photographs of the fractures, photographs of the missile tubes, and in some of the frames photographs of the crew, or what the deep had left of them. There is a detail from those images that has stayed with me since the first time I read about it. In one photograph, visible on the sea floor near the wreck, is a human body still in its clothing, one leg missing at the boot, preserved in the extraordinary cold. Not a skeleton, not a shape, a man lying in the dark exactly where he'd come to rest. The intelligence officers who reviewed that film were not sentimental people. They were professionals in the middle of a very serious business, and by every account that survives, the room got quiet. Now, this is where the theory takes the real photographs and adds one more. According to the conspiracy, among the thousands of frames that came back from the halibut, there was a sequence that was pulled from the standard archive before the film was even fully catalogued. Not classified in the ordinary sense, because everything about this was already classified. Removed, placed into a separate compartment with a separate list of names, so short that it could be written on an index card. What those frames showed, the story says, was that the submarine was not alone on the sea floor. Lying against the hull, near the stern, partially settled into the sediment, was a second object. It was, in the words that the theory always uses, smooth. That word does a lot of work. Everything human on the seafloor is not smooth. A submarine is a landscape of welds, rivets, fairings, limber holes, cleats, hatches, and hard edges, and after even a short time in salt water, it begins to grow a skin of rust and marine snow and slow chemical decay. The deep marks everything it touches. The object in the photographs had none of that. No seams, no fasteners, no corrosion, no growth. A single continuous surface, ovoid, roughly the length of a bus, resting against the dead submarine like something that had settled there or had been placed. And the sediment around it, the theory says, told its own story. When a heavy object falls 3 miles through water, it does not land gently. It arrives, and it displaces the bottom, and it leaves a crater and a plume. There should have been a scar. The photographs showed no scar at all. Whatever it was, according to the story, it had not fallen. It had arrived. The meeting that followed does not appear in any declassified record. That is not by itself remarkable. Enormous numbers of meetings do not appear in declassified records. Government is mostly conversation, and conversation mostly evaporates. But the conspiracy theory builds a room for us anyway, and it is worth walking through that room, because it tells you something about how these stories are constructed, and why they feel so plausible when you're lying in the dark. Picture a windowless conference room somewhere in Northern Virginia. A long table, ashtrays, because it is 1968 and everyone smokes. A projector at one end throwing a rectangle of light onto a screen, and in that rectangle, an image from 3 miles beneath the Pacific. Around the table sit men from the Central Intelligence Agency, from the Navy, and from the Defense Intelligence Agency. They have spent their careers looking at photographs of things their adversaries did not want them to see. They are not easily impressed, and they are professionally allergic to excitement. They look at the object for a long time. Somebody asks the obvious question first, the way somebody always does. Is it Soviet? Is this a new system, a towed array, a survey package, something experimental that we have not catalogued? And the answer, according to the story, is that it cannot be, for a reason that is not about capability but about economics. The Soviet Union in 1968 built things the way it built everything, which is to say heavily, functionally and visibly. Their engineering was often excellent and almost never elegant. Nothing in their inventory looked like an unbroken seamless shell. Nothing in anyone's inventory did. The manufacturing base to produce a hull like that, without a single weld or fastener, at that scale, did not exist on this planet. So then someone asks the second question. Can we recover it? And the answer that comes back in the version of this story that has circulated for decades is the line that gives the whole conspiracy its shape, not with anything that officially exists. I want to pause here, because there is something genuinely interesting underneath the fiction. The real Project Azorian was, by any reasonable measure, an insane undertaking. Consider what was actually proposed. Build a ship from scratch, larger than most warships. Build inside that ship a mechanism capable of reaching down 3 miles, closing around a sunken submarine weighing thousands of tons, and lifting it, intact, through nearly 17,000 feet of water, while the ship above holds position within a few feet in open ocean, in weather, without any of it being noticed by the Soviet Navy, which would certainly come to look. Nothing like it had ever been attempted. Most of the technology did not exist and had to be invented. The eventual cost has been estimated at something in the region of $350 million in 1970s money, which in today's terms would be well over $1 billion. And what was the prize exactly? The official answer is intelligence, Soviet nuclear warheads, to study their design. Cryptographic machines and code books, which would have been enormously valuable. Documents, sonar equipment. Skeptics have asked, reasonably, whether that prize was really worth that price. The submarine was an older diesel boat, not a frontline nuclear vessel. The warheads were of a known generation. The code material would have been years out of date by the time it was recovered, and would in any case have been soaked in salt water for 6 years. There were, and are, serious people who looked at the cost and the benefit, and could not make the arithmetic balance. The conspiracy theory offers an arithmetic that balances perfectly. They were never buying a submarine. They were buying the thing lying next to it, and the submarine was the receipt. Now, let us come up out of the deep water for a while, into the sunlight, because the next part of this story is one of the strangest exercises in public deception ever conducted, and every word of it is true. If you're going to build the largest and most unusual ship in the world, you cannot hide it. A vessel of that size takes years to construct, in a shipyard, in the open, in front of thousands of workers and anyone with a pair of binoculars. It will be photographed. It will be written about in trade journals. Reporters will ask what it is for. So the agency did not try to hide the ship. They did something much cleverer. They gave the world a complete, detailed, internally consistent and entirely false explanation. And then they let the world's own enthusiasm do the rest of the work. The explanation was manganese nodules. Here is the wonderful thing about that choice. Manganese nodules are real. They genuinely lie scattered across parts of the deep ocean floor, lumps of mineral roughly the size of a potato, formed over millions of years, containing manganese, nickel, copper, and cobalt. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, there was real, serious, well-funded interest in the idea that they might be harvested commercially. Conferences were held, papers were published, investors were interested. It was, in other words, exactly the kind of plausible frontier venture that a wealthy eccentric might throw money at. And there was no wealthier or more eccentric figure available than Howard Hughes. Hughes was, at that point, one of the most famous men alive and one of the least seen. Aviator, film producer, industrialist, defence contractor, and by the 1970s a recluse of legendary proportions, a man who had withdrawn so completely from public life that his condition, and even his continued existence, were the subject of open speculation. His companies did enormous classified work for the American government. His name attached to a project explained everything, and nothing at once. If Howard Hughes announced that he was going to spend a fortune building an impossible ship to vacuum minerals off the floor of the Pacific, nobody in the world would find that strange. It was, in fact, the single most Howard Hughes thing imaginable. So the ship was named the Hughes Glomar Explorer, and the world was told what it was for, and the world believed it. She was built at a yard in Pennsylvania and launched in 1972. She was around 618 feet long. She displaced roughly 50,000 tons. Amidships, she carried a derrick tower that rose more than 200 feet above the deck, so that from a distance she looked like an oil drilling vessel that had wandered a very long way from anywhere that had oil. And in her belly was the thing that made her different from every other ship that has ever floated. The centre of the vessel was hollow, not a hold, a hole. A vast rectangular opening running down through the hull to the sea, nearly 200 feet long, sealed at the bottom by enormous sliding gates. When those gates were closed, it was a swimming pool the size of a city block sitting inside a ship. When they opened, it became a doorway to the ocean. They called it the moon pool. It exists so that the ship could bring something up from the sea floor into the interior of the hull and close the doors behind it, so that whatever had been recovered would be inside the ship, hidden from satellites, from aircraft, from any Soviet trawler that happened to be loitering nearby with a camera. Above the moon pool ran a string of pipe. Not drill pipe in the ordinary sense, but specially engineered sections, each one designed to be threaded to the next, so that as the lift proceeded the string would grow, section by section, downward into the black. 16,500 feet of steel hanging in the water, supporting an enormous weight at its far end, while the ship above rode the swell. To keep the ship from tearing that string apart every time a wave passed, they built a heave compensation system, a set of hydraulic and pneumatic devices that allowed the derrick to hold the pipe steady in space, while the ship itself moved up and down beneath it. To keep the ship in position, they built an automated station-keeping system tied to thrusters and to acoustic beacons dropped on the sea floor, which could hold the vessel within a few feet of a fixed point in open ocean. And then there was the Claw. Officially it was the capture vehicle. Unofficially and universally it was Clementine. It was a jointed steel structure the size of a house, weighing thousands of tons, with a set of enormous articulated arms designed to close beneath a submarine hull, cradle it, and hold on. Clementine could not simply be lifted aboard the Glomar Explorer at a pier, because anybody watching would immediately understand that a mineral harvesting ship does not need a machine shaped like a hand. So they built a barge, an enormous submersible barge constructed at a yard on San Francisco Bay behind screens, with a roof over it. The Claw was assembled inside, the barge was towed out to a quiet stretch of coastline, and there, in deep water, the barge submerged itself, sinking beneath the surface with the Claw inside. The Glomar Explorer positioned herself directly above, opened her moonpool gates, and drew Clementine up into her own belly from below, out of sight, underwater, where no satellite could see it happen. They transferred the most secret object in the operation from one vessel to another, without either of them ever showing it to the sky. I find that beautiful in a way. Not morally beautiful, just beautiful the way a piece of engineering can be, when a group of people look at an impossible constraint, and instead of arguing with it, they design their way around it. And here is where the conspiracy inserts its wedge, and I have to admit it is inserted skillfully. Clementine was redesigned. That is true. The capture vehicle went through significant engineering revisions during development, and the schedule slipped, and costs grew, and the team design in particular was altered more than once. This is normal. Everything about the project was unprecedented, and everything about it changed as the engineers learned. The theory takes that documented fact and asks a question about it. Why, it asks, was the grabbing structure designed with such enormous margins? Why was so much attention paid to holding force? Why do certain surviving descriptions of the capture vehicle emphasize that it was designed to grip an object whose material properties were, in the phrase the theory always uses, not fully characterized? The Claw was not built for steel, the story says. It was built for something they could not put a number on. That is a good line, and you should notice that it is a good line, because good lines are how these stories travel. The strength of a conspiracy theory has almost nothing to do with evidence, and almost everything to do with narrative. This one is well made. Someone took the real gaps in a real record and filled them with a shape. Now let us go back down. It is the summer of 1974. 6 years have passed since a submarine stopped transmitting. 6 years of design, construction, testing, sea trials, and cover story maintenance. The Glomar Explorer is on station in the North Pacific, roughly 1,500 miles from Hawaii, holding position over a point on the sea floor that only a few dozen people in the world can identify. The weather is not good. It is rarely good out there. There is a long swell coming in from somewhere far away, and the ship rides it, and the derrick tower sways with a slow, deliberate motion that everyone aboard has learned to walk with. The pipe string goes down. I want to describe this properly because it is the single most extraordinary industrial process in this entire story, and it is almost never depicted well. Every section of pipe must be lifted from storage, positioned above the moon pool, threaded onto the top of the string and torqued. Then the whole string is lowered by the length of that section, and the next one comes, and the next. Around the clock, in shifts, for days. As the string gets longer, it gets heavier, and the load on the derrick climbs, and the tolerance for error shrinks. Near the end, that string of steel is carrying thousands of tons hanging beneath it, and it is stretching under its own weight, measurably longer than it would be lying on the ground. The people running the operation must account for that stretch, because otherwise their position readings are wrong by a distance greater than the object they are trying to grab, and all the while the ocean is trying to break it. Every swell that passes lifts the ship. If the ship lifts and the pipe does not, something has to give. That is what the compensation system is for, and it works mostly, and everyone aboard listens to it work, hour after hour, the deep hydraulic sigh of it, the sound of a machine holding an entire ship still against the sea. Down goes Clementine into the dark. Below the first few 100 feet the colour goes. Red disappears first, then orange, then yellow, until everything is a deep filtered blue. By 1,000 feet even that is failing. By 2,000 there is nothing, not dimness, nothing. The claw descends into a volume of water that has never in the entire history of the planet been lit. The temperature falls toward freezing. The pressure climbs past anything a person could survive, past anything most machines could survive, until at the bottom every square inch of surface is carrying more than 7,000 pounds of force. And down there, waiting, is a submarine that has been lying in the dark for 6 years, and 98 men who never came home, and according to the story we're following tonight, something else. The sonar aboard the Glomar Explorer was superb. It had to be, because there was no other way to know where the claw was. Cameras and lights were fitted to the capture vehicle, but at that depth, in disturbed sediment, vision is a matter of a few feet at best. The operators flew Clementine mostly by sound, watching returns on a screen, building a picture of the sea floor and the wreck out of echoes. This is real. And it is here, in the real technical fact, that the crew's primary sense was acoustic, that the conspiracy plants its next detail. Something moved. Not the wreck settling, not sediment sliding. According to the theory, the sonar returns during the descent showed intermittent contacts in the water column near the target, small and coherent, appearing and vanishing, holding position against the current in a way that nothing drifting can do. Deep water is not empty. It is full of life, and much of that life is strange, and any sonar operator working at depth will see returns from fish and squid, and the great migrating layers of small animals that rise and fall with the day. That is the ordinary explanation, and it is almost certainly the correct one for any real anomaly anyone ever saw. The theory does not accept the ordinary explanation. It says the contacts were not biological, because they did not behave biologically. They did not scatter. They did not drift. They held station relative to the wreck, at intervals, as though arranged. And then, the story says, The operators watching the camera feeds began to see lights. Let me tell you what is actually true about lights in the deep, because the truth is more wonderful than the fiction, and it is the reason this part of the story is so effective. Below the reach of the sun, most of the animals that live there make their own light. Not a few of them, most of them. Somewhere between 3/4 and 9/10 of the creatures in the deep open ocean are bioluminescent. They glow with chemistry, producing cold light from reactions in specialized organs, and they use it for everything. To lure prey, to startle predators, to signal to each other, to disguise their own silhouettes against the faint glow from above. And the colour, overwhelmingly, is blue. There is a reason for that. Blue and blue-green light travels further through seawater than any other wavelength. Red light is absorbed within meters, blue carries. So evolution, working independently in dozens of separate lineages, arrived at the same answer over and over again, and the result is that the deep ocean, which we imagine as a lightless void, is in fact quietly full of small blue sparks, drifting and pulsing in the dark, all the way down. So when the theory tells us that men aboard the Glomar Explorer watched their monitors and saw faint blue lights moving through the black water around the wreck, the first thing to say is that they may very well have. Anyone who has ever put a camera down there has seen them. It is one of the most commonly reported observations in all of deep-sea work. But the story does not stop at seeing them. It says that the lights at first were dismissed. Interference, sense and noise, marine life. The operators had a submarine to lift and no interest in glowing plankton. It says that over the following hours the behaviour changed. The lights, according to the theory, began to arrange themselves, not swarming, which is what living things do, arranging, holding relative position to one another, moving as a set, maintaining spacing, describing slow circuits around the wreck at a constant standoff distance, as though following the edge of something the men above could not see. And it says that one of the camera operators, a man whose name has never been attached to this account in any verifiable form, began recording continuously, rather than in bursts, and filled a series of reels and turned them in at the end of his shift, and that the reels were logged and taken and never seen again by anyone aboard. You're lying in the dark right now, and I'm telling you about lights in a much deeper dark, and I want you to notice something about how that feels. There is a particular unease in the idea of being watched from below, and it is very old, and it does not really belong to the Cold War at all. Every seafaring culture on Earth has some version of it. Something down there, something that knows we're up here. The story we're following is a Cold War story wearing modern clothes, but the fear inside it is thousands of years older than the Central Intelligence Agency. Let the lights drift. Let them go. The claw reached the sea floor. In reality, in the documented history, this was the moment everything had been built for. Clementine settled around the forward section of K129. The tines closed beneath the hull, the grip was confirmed, and the lift began. And in the documented history, this is also the moment where it went wrong. We will come to that. In the conspiracy, something else happens first. The story says that as the capture vehicle made contact, systems aboard the Glomar Explorer began to misbehave. It says the ship's electrical distribution developed transients, brief unexplained fluctuations that tripped breakers in unrelated circuits. It says magnetic compasses aboard swung and wandered, and that the gyro compasses required repeated correction. It says that the station-keeping system, which had been holding the ship within a few feet of its target point for days, began reporting position errors that did not correspond to any wind or current the bridge could observe. And it says that the timing equipment drifted. That last detail is the one that separates this story from 100 other haunted machine stories, and it is worth understanding why it is included. Precision timing was not a small matter aboard that vessel. Acoustic positioning works by measuring how long it takes a sound to travel from a beacon to a receiver. If your clock is wrong, your position is wrong. The systems aboard were referenced to extremely stable oscillators, the best available, drifting by amounts so small that they would not matter in an ordinary human lifetime. According to the theory, during the hours the claw was in contact with the target, those references drifted by fractions of a second in a way that could not be accounted for by temperature, by power supply, or by any known fault. And an engineer, the story says, wrote a single sentence in a log that was later removed from the record. The disturbance originates from the unidentified object, not the submarine. Now, take a breath. Let it out slowly. Because the next part of this story is real, and it is genuinely tragic, and it deserves to be told plainly before we go back into speculation. The lift began. The claw held the forward section of K129, and the pipe string began to come up, section by section, exactly as it had gone down but in reverse, hour after hour, hauling thousands of tons of steel and sediment and seawater up through 3 miles of ocean. And somewhere in that ascent, several of the tines on the capture vehicle failed. The metallurgy has been discussed for decades. There are accounts pointing to the properties of the high-strength steel chosen for the grabbers, and to the way that steel behaved under sustained load at low temperature, and to the enormous concentrated stresses at the points where the tines took the weight. Whatever the precise cause, the arms broke, and the submarine broke with them. Most of the section that had been lifted came apart and fell away, tumbling back down into the dark, scattering across the sea floor. What reached the surface, according to the accounts that have emerged, was only a portion of what had been grabbed. The bow section, a fraction of the prize, 6 years, a ship built from nothing, hundreds of millions of dollars, an entire fictional mining industry conjured into existence to hide it, and most of it fell back into the abyss in a matter of seconds. There is something almost unbearable about that, as an engineering story. You can build the impossible machine and hold the ship steady against the ocean and reach down 3 miles into the dark and take hold of the thing you came for, and still, in the end, the deep can simply take it back. What did come up mattered, though it has never been fully described in public, and it included the remains of 6 Soviet sailors. The Americans did something with those remains that I have always found genuinely moving. They gave them a funeral. Aboard the ship at sea, the crew conducted a proper burial. There was a service. There was a Soviet naval ensign. There were words spoken in Russian as well as English. The remains were placed in a steel container and returned to the ocean with military honours, by men whose entire purpose out there had been to steal from the country those sailors served. The whole thing was filmed. And in 1992, after the Soviet Union had ceased to exist, the director of the Central Intelligence Agency travelled to Moscow and handed that film to the President of Russia. Families who had spent almost 25 years under a cloud of rumour, whose husbands and fathers and sons had been quietly suspected of desertion or betrayal, finally learned that their men had died at their posts and had been buried with respect by strangers. I think about that a lot. In the middle of one of the most cynical operations of the Cold War, a group of men stopped and did the decent thing, and then kept the record of it for a quarter of a century, until it could be given to the people who needed it most. That is the true story of what came up. The conspiracy says that is only the true story of what came up first. According to the theory, the failure of the tines was real, and the loss of the submarine section was real, and the reason both happened was not metallurgy. The story says that as the lift passed a certain depth, the object attached to the wreck became active. Not in a dramatic sense. Nothing exploded, nothing lit up. The theory is careful about this, and its carefulness is part of why it persists. It says that the instrument simply began to report values that made no sense, and that the load on the pipe string began to vary in ways that did not correspond to the movement of the ship or the sea, and that at one point the tension reading showed the entire assembly being pulled downward against a lift that was still rising, and that the tines did not shear from overload in the way a structural engineer would expect. They failed, the story says, in the wrong order. Whatever you make of that, the fact that lingers underneath is real enough. a public record of exactly what happened during that recovery and exactly what was retrieved remains incomplete to this day. Large portions of the documentation released under Freedom of Information requests are redacted. Some of the key internal histories were released only after decades of litigation and released heavily censored. There are, without question, things about Project Azorian that the United States government still declines to describe. That is not evidence of an object on the sea floor. It is evidence of an intelligence agency behaving like an intelligence agency. But it is a space, and stories grow in spaces. The next piece of the theory is the signal. According to the story, during the final hours of the lift, communications personnel aboard the Glomar Explorer logged an anomalous reception on receivers that should not have been receiving anything at all. It was not Soviet traffic. It was not American traffic. It was not Morse. It carried no recognisable modulation of any kind that the operators could identify. It was a repeating pattern of pulses, and it arrived on a schedule, every 33 seconds. I want to talk about that number for a moment, because the choice of it is not accidental, and it tells you something about the architecture of stories like this one. 33 is a number that carries a great deal of cultural weight. It shows up constantly in conspiracy literature, in numerology, in secret society mythology. It has a strange resonance to it. It is memorable. It sits in the mind. If you were constructing a story and you wanted an interval that would be repeated by everyone who retold it, 33 seconds is a far better choice than 31 or 37, even though 31 and 37 are mathematically more interesting numbers. And that matters, because the punchline of this section of the theory is a mathematical one. The story says the pattern was eventually passed to analysts, and that the analysts, working with pulse counts rather than frequencies, noticed something in the spacing. 2 pulses, pause, 3 pulses, pause, 5, then 7, then 11, then 13, and on upward, in perfect order, through the prime numbers. Now, here is the thing. That idea is not invented. It is one of the oldest and most serious proposals in the entire field of searching for intelligence beyond the Earth. If you wanted to send a signal across space to announce that you exist, you would face an enormous problem, which is that you and your recipient share no language, no symbols, no images, and no assumptions. The only thing you can be reasonably confident that any technological civilization possesses is mathematics. And prime numbers are the cleanest possible demonstration of mathematics. They cannot be produced by any simple physical process. A pulsar can flash with astonishing regularity, but it cannot count. A natural resonance can hold a frequency, but it cannot skip 4 and go to 5. A sequence of primes is a fingerprint of something that knows how to think. This is why, in the real world, scientists have proposed exactly this kind of transmission, and why in the great novels and films about first contact, the primes show up again and again. So when the theory says that a repeating prime sequence was detected coming from 3 miles beneath the North Pacific in 1974, it is borrowing a genuinely elegant scientific idea and putting it somewhere it does not belong. That is the craft of it. Every good conspiracy theory is a mosaic of true tiles arranged into a false picture. The signal, the story says, stopped when the lift was aborted, and it never resumed. Come up with me now, out of the water, into the belly of the ship. The moon pool of the Glomar Explorer, with the gates closed and the water pumped down, was one of the strangest interior spaces ever built. Imagine a cathedral turned inside out, a rectangular chasm running down through the middle of a ship, ringed with steel galleries, lit by work lamps, echoing, dripping, the air thick with the smell of the deep ocean, which is not the smell of the beach at all, but something colder, and more mineral and faintly wrong. When the recovered section came up out of the water into that space, it came slowly, and it came in silence because there is nothing to say. What emerged was a piece of a submarine that had been crushed, torn and dead for 6 years. Steel folded like fabric, frames exposed, sediment pouring out of every opening in grey rivers, and inside it, In the compartments, the things that the men aboard the Glomar Explorer had known they would find, and had tried in advance not to think about too clearly. There is a detail that survives from accounts of that moment. The recovered section was radioactive, mildly but measurably, from a torpedo warhead aboard. It also carried the accumulated biological reality of 6 years on the sea floor. The interior work was done in protective gear, methodically, by people who had trained for it, in shifts, and by every account it was among the hardest work any of them had ever done. That is real. Hold on to it. It is the human flaw beneath this entire story. Now the theory builds its room again. According to the conspiracy, the second object came up in a separate lift, or in the same lift within a separate cradle, depending on which version you encounter. The inconsistency there is itself informative, and you should notice it. Genuine documents converge as more of them come to light. Legends diverge, but every version agrees on the description. The object, they say, was intact. The submarine had been shattered by 6 years of pressure and by the failure of the claw. The object had not a mark on it, no deformation, no scoring, no sediment adhering to its surface, which is itself a strange claim, because everything that spends time on the seafloor acquires a coating of fine grey mud that clings, and the surface, according to every telling, did something to light. It did not shine. It did not reflect the work lamps overhead. It did not produce highlights or a glare or a visible curve of brightness along its upper edge the way a polished hull would. The story says that looking at it was disorienting, because the eye had nothing to fix on. The shape read as a silhouette rather than an object, a hole cut in the room, and men found themselves unable to judge how far away it was. There is a real physical phenomenon lurking underneath that description. Materials engineered to absorb rather than reflect radiation are not fantasy. There are surfaces made of aligned carbon nanotube forests that absorb well over 99% of visible light, and photographs of objects coated in them genuinely do look like errors in the image, like something has been deleted from the picture. That technology arrived decades after 1974, but it exists, and the fact that it exists makes the older story feel more possible than it did when it was first told. That is how these theories stay alive. The world catches up to their imagery, and the imagery gets a second life. Into this room, the story brings a scientist. She is not a real person. I want to be direct about that because it matters. The name attached to her in the conspiracy literature is Dr. Evelyn Hartman, described as a civilian materials physicist, and no such person has ever been identified in any personnel record, publication list, or academic register connected to the project. She is a character. The story says she was flown out to the ship by helicopter, at night, from a carrier, without being told where she was going or why. It says she was walked down through the galleries to the edge of the moon pool and shown the object, and that she was given no briefing at all before she saw it, which is a detail included to make her reaction seem uncontaminated. It says she looked at it for less than 10 minutes, and then she asked to leave, not to be given time, not to be given equipment or samples or a laboratory, to leave immediately. And the story says she would not go back down to the moon pool level again for the remainder of her time aboard, and she sat in a cabin with the door open until the helicopter came back for her. Her written assessment, according to the theory, consisted of a single sentence. This material cannot have been manufactured using any known metallurgical process. The report, they say, was classified above the level at which the recovery operation itself was held into a compartment created specifically for it, and the number of people cleared for that compartment never exceeded a dozen. Now, whether or not you believe a word of that, consider the storytelling. She is a good character precisely because she is restrained. She does not scream. She does not say the word alien. She says something narrow, technical, and defensible in the voice of a professional refusing to speculate, and that refusal is what makes her sound credible. The best invented witnesses always understate. Here is the part of the theory that I find the most quietly effective, because it does not describe a discovery at all. It describes an absence. The story says that when the Glomar explorer eventually made port, the object was moved off the ship in a sealed transport container. A heavy steel shell, welded rather than bolted, moved at night on a low loader under escort along a route cleared in advance. It says that at some point during that transfer, security cameras covering the route lost power. Not all of them. A segment. For a period variously described as somewhere between 40 seconds and 4 minutes, depending on the telling. When the recording resumed, the convoy was still moving. The container was still on the trailer. The escort was still in position. The welds were unbroken. The seals were unbroken. Nobody had stopped. Nobody had approached. Nothing on the road had changed in any way that anyone could see. And when the container reached its destination and was cut open, the story says, it was empty. No damage, no breach, no residue, no mark on the interior to show that anything had ever rested there. That is a well-built ending for a section, and you should notice why. It removes the evidence in a way that explains, in advance, why no evidence will ever be produced. The story becomes unfalsifiable at exactly the moment it becomes most extraordinary, and it does so with a scene rather than an argument. What followed, in the theory, is the part that makes it a Cold War story rather than a monster story. The compartment created for the object outlived the operation. It was renamed. The story calls it Operation Deep Silence, though that name appears nowhere except in the conspiracy literature, and has the unmistakable ring of something invented by an enthusiast rather than assigned by a bureaucracy, which tends to produce far duller names on purpose. Its purpose, according to the story, was not to investigate what had been recovered. It was to remove it from the record. Every reference to the anomaly, in every photograph log, every dive report, every engineering memorandum, every meeting minute, was to be located and excised. Not destroyed, necessarily. Moved. Files were re-indexed. Photographic sequences were renumbered so that the gaps did not show. Personnel who had seen the frames were interviewed, reminded of their obligations and dispersed. And the cover story, which had already been built to hide an intelligence operation from the world, was quietly repurposed to hide something else from the intelligence community itself. The mining venture concealed the submarine recovery. The submarine recovery concealed the object. 2 shells, one inside the other, and if you cracked the outer one you would find a secret so genuinely astonishing that you would never think to look for another one behind it. That, honestly, is the most interesting idea in this entire theory. Not the object, the structure. The suggestion that the most effective way to hide something is not to bury it, but to place a slightly smaller marvel in front of it, so that anyone who digs will find something wonderful and stop digging. Now let us come back up into the daylight and into the real world again, because what actually happened next is almost stranger than the fiction. The secret did not hold. In 1974, burglars broke into the offices of a Hughes company in Los Angeles and took documents from a safe. Among them were papers relating to the Glomar Explorer. What exactly they understood about what they had taken is unclear, but the theft set off an internal alarm, and rumours began to circulate among journalists. The Central Intelligence Agency spent months in an extraordinary campaign to keep the story out of print, approaching editors and publishers directly and asking them, in the national interest, to hold. Remarkably, many of them did. But a story that many people know cannot be held forever. In February of 1975, the Los Angeles Times published an account. It was partly garbled, placing the operation in the wrong ocean, but it was out. And in March, the columnist Jack Anderson broadcast the story to a national audience, having decided that the public interest lay in telling rather than in silence. The operation was dead. A second recovery attempt, which had been planned to go back for the rest of the submarine, was cancelled. The Soviets, now fully aware of what had happened, began keeping ships over the site. The Glomar Explorer, the most extraordinary vessel of her generation, was mothballed, then leased, then used for ordinary commercial deep-sea drilling, and eventually scrapped. And then came the small bureaucratic moment that would outlive everything else. A journalist named Harriet Ann Philippi filed a Freedom of Information request, asking the agency for its records about the operation and about its own attempts to suppress coverage of it. The agency faced a genuine problem. If it said the records existed, that confirmed the operation. If it said they did not exist, that was a lie, and one that might be exposed. So it invented a third answer. It replied that it could neither confirm nor deny the existence of the requested records. That phrase went to court. It survived. And it entered the permanent vocabulary of the American government, where it remains to this day, used thousands of times since, in cases having nothing to do with submarines or oceans. It is called, in law and in practice, the Glomar response. Every time an agency anywhere in the world refuses to say whether a file exists, it is using a technique that was created because of a sunken Soviet submarine and a ship pretending to mine rocks. That is real. That is the actual verifiable legacy of Project Azorian, and it is arguably a larger legacy than anything that came up out of the water. And of course, to a conspiracy theorist, it is also the perfect artifact, a legal instrument, born from this exact operation, whose entire function is to make absence and presence indistinguishable. Move forward with me now, past the 1970s, past the end of the Soviet Union, past the slow declassification of a few hundred heavily censored pages, and into the present. The modern chapter of this theory is built around a researcher called Dr. Carolyn Mercer, described as a maritime historian. Like the physicist, she is a character rather than a person, and no such historian appears in any faculty listing or publication record associated with this subject. But the work she supposedly does is the kind of work that real archival researchers genuinely do, and describing it is the story's way of borrowing credibility. She begins, according to the theory, not with the exciting material, but with the boring material. That is a nice touch, because it is exactly right. Real archival discoveries almost never come from the dramatic documents. They come from logistics. She compares crew rosters against pay records. She compares helicopter movement logs against personnel manifests. She compares the ship's engineering maintenance schedule against the daily operational log, looking not for what is written, but for the rhythm of the writing, because a document series has a rhythm the way a heartbeat does, and an interruption shows. And she finds interruptions, shifts that appear in one record and not another, a helicopter arrival with no corresponding departure, a block of maintenance entries missing from a period when, by every other measure, the ship's machinery was working at its absolute limit and would have been generating more paperwork than at any other time in its life, not less. The theory makes a great deal of that last point, and it is the strongest argumentative move in the entire construction, so I want to give it its due. The claim is not that there is a suspicious document. The claim is that there is a suspicious silence in a place where noise should have been loudest. The ordinary explanation, of course, is that this was a covert operation conducted under extraordinary security by an intelligence agency that fully intended the record to be incomplete, that documents were destroyed or never created by design, that different record series were held in different compartments and released in different decades under different review standards, and that what looks like a hole in the story is really just the join between two archives. That explanation is almost certainly correct. It is also, and this is the whole difficulty, completely indistinguishable from the other one. The next artifact in the modern chapter is a notebook. The story says that Mercer obtained the private journal of a saturation diver who had worked briefly on inspections connected to the recovered material, and who died some years ago. It came, they say, from a family estate, sold in a box of unrelated papers, unnoticed. Most of the journal is unremarkable. Weather, meals, complaints about equipment, the small, repetitive, deeply human record of a working man far from home, which is what almost every private journal in history actually is. And then, on one page, there is a drawing. It is not a good drawing. That detail is always included, and it is always included for the same reason, which is that a bad drawing feels more honest than a good one. A polished illustration looks like a production. A rough sketch looks like something a tired man made in a bunk because he could not stop thinking about what he had seen. The sketch shows a long shape, recognisable as a submarine hull in profile, and against it, near the stern, a smooth oval mass with no features at all, and underneath, 5 words. It wasn't part of K129. No provenance for this notebook has ever been established. No photograph of the page has ever circulated in a form that could be examined. The diver has no name in any version I've ever read, which is a strange omission for a document supposedly obtained from an identifiable estate, and that omission is one of the clearest signals of what this artefact really is. But I will tell you honestly that the image is effective. There is something about the idea of a private drawing made without an audience that gets underneath the reasoning part of the mind. Testimony can be motivated. A doodle in a personal notebook made by a man with no reason to lie to himself feels different. It is not different. It is simply a better designed story. The last artefact is a recording. According to the theory, Mercer's final discovery was a badly degraded reel of audio, recovered from a collection of surplus material, recorded aboard the Glomar Explorer during the operation. Much of it is unusable. The tape has been stored badly for half a century, and print-through and oxide shedding have left long stretches of noise. But in one passage the story says, 3 voices are audible over the background of a working ship. The first says, forget the submarine. The second says, what if they come back for it? And the third, after a pause, says, they already know we have it. And then the tape ends. I want to point out the craft in that exchange, because it is the most carefully engineered moment in the entire theory. Notice what it does not do. Nobody says what the object is. Nobody uses a word like alien or craft or vessel. Nobody explains anything to anybody, which is exactly how real recorded conversation works, because people who share a context do not narrate it to each other. And notice the pronoun, they, undefined, unmodified, unexplained, doing an enormous amount of work in a very small space. The most frightening word in that entire exchange is a word that a 2-year-old can use. That is not accidental. Whoever assembled this story understood something true about fear, which is that it lives in the unspecified. And then there is the final document. Among the last of the declassified pages, according to the theory, is a memorandum addressed to the Director of Central Intelligence dated after the operation had ended and after the story had broken publicly. Almost the entire page is blacked out. Redaction of that era was done physically, with a marker or a mask and a photocopier, and the result is a page that is mostly a solid black field with islands of type surviving in it. The story says that the memorandum recommends that the operation never again be discussed outside a specific closed circle, regardless of how much of it becomes public, and regardless of what is admitted about the submarine. And it says that the final line of the page survived the censor. 6 words. Recovery objective remains unaccounted for. That is the whole theory, compressed into a sentence, not a claim about what was found, a claim about a discrepancy. Something was retrieved, and it is not where it should be, and somebody in an office wrote that down and someone else failed to black it out. There is no such memorandum in the declassified record. I want to say that plainly. The material that has been released about Project Azorian is extensive, heavily redacted, and does not contain that line. It has never been produced. It exists as a quotation without a source, repeated from one telling to the next, gaining authority through repetition alone, which is the way that almost every famous quotation in conspiracy literature comes into being. But you will notice, if you sit with it, that it is a perfect artifact for a story about the Glomar response. a document that cannot be confirmed or denied, describing something that cannot be located, in an operation whose lasting legal legacy is the right to refuse to say whether a file exists at all. Let us come back to the water. The North Pacific is still there tonight. It is there right now while you are lying in the dark listening to this, moving the way it has always moved, under a sky with no lights on it for 1,000 miles in any direction. And beneath it, 3 miles down, most of K129 is still lying on the sediment where she came to rest in the spring of 1968. The section that was recovered is gone. The sections that fell back from the claw are scattered across the bottom, further broken, further settled, slowly disappearing under the grey snow that never stops falling down there. 98 men went into the water. 6 came back up briefly and were returned with honours. The rest are still there, in the cold and the dark and the silence, in a grave deeper than any other grave on this planet, at a set of coordinates that a small number of people know and will not say. That is the true weight of this story, underneath all the speculation, and I do not want us to leave it behind. Because here is what I think, and you can carry this down into sleep with you, and do whatever you like with it. The real Project Azorian did not need an alien object to be extraordinary. Think about what actually happened. A country lost a submarine and could not find it. Another country found it by listening, from the other side of the world, to a sound in the water. Then that country built a ship the size of a skyscraper laid on its side, and a claw the size of a house, and an entire fictional industry to explain them both, and borrowed the name of a recluse to make the fiction glamorous, and sailed out into the middle of the ocean, and reached down 3 miles through absolute darkness, and took hold of a submarine, and lifted it. And it almost worked. That is not a small thing dressed up as a big one. That is one of the most audacious things any group of human beings has ever attempted, and it was carried out by ordinary people doing shifts, threading pipe, developing film, watching sonar screens, eating in a mess hall, missing their families, most of them never fully knowing what they were part of. The conspiracy adds an object to that story, but it also quietly takes something away. It suggests that human beings could not possibly have wanted the submarine badly enough, that no group of engineers would go to that much trouble for cryptographic gear and warheads, that there had to be something more. And that is where I think it is wrong, in a way that is worth noticing. People do impossible things for unglamorous reasons all the time. That is in fact most of what history is. Still, the record is incomplete. The redactions are real. The full inventory of what came up out of the water that summer has never been published, and the agency that conducted the operation retains permanently the legal right to decline to tell you whether any given document about it exists. Somewhere in a facility, there are boxes that have not been opened for review. Somewhere there are frames of film from the halibut that no historian has ever seen, and every few years another tranche is released, blacked out in new places, and the researchers go through it line by line looking for the shape of what is missing. Most likely there is nothing there. Most likely the missing pieces are exactly what they appear to be, which is the ordinary secrecy of an ordinary intelligence service protecting sources and methods that stopped mattering decades ago. Most likely. But the Pacific is very large, and very deep, and very dark, and there are more things on the floor of it than anyone has ever catalogued. The seabed has been mapped in detail across only a fraction of its area. We have better maps of the surface of Mars than of the bottom of our own ocean. So when the story says that something was down there, waiting, long before the Cold War began, the honest answer is not that it is impossible. The honest answer is that we have not looked. History remembers Project Azorian as a mission to recover Soviet secrets from the bottom of the ocean. According to the conspiracy, the CIA spent hundreds of millions of dollars retrieving something that had been waiting beneath the Pacific long before the Cold War ever began. And the greatest achievement of that operation was never lifting a submarine from 3 miles down. before we begin tonight, a warm thank you goes out to Phil Bruce. Now, settle in, get comfortable. Because what I'm about to walk you through is the kind of thing that, once you hear it, you can't quite unhear. If you want to hide something real, you don't classify it, you fictionalize it. There is a database on the internet that has existed for nearly 2 decades. It spans tens of thousands of entries. It describes, in meticulous procedural detail, anomalous objects, entities, locations, and phenomena. Things that defy the known laws of physics, biology, and human psychology. It catalogues them, numbers them, explains how to contain them. The world calls it fiction, a collaborative writing project, a creative exercise, a hobby forum where talented authors spin elaborate horror. That's the official explanation, and for most people it's enough. They read an entry, they feel a chill, they close the tab and go to sleep. But I am not most people. I spent 11 years as an intelligence analyst, not the kind you see in films, not running through airports or decrypting enemy transmissions in real time. My job was quieter than that, and in many ways more unsettling. I read documents, thousands upon thousands of documents. I learned to recognise the fingerprints of institutional language, the way bureaucracies write, the way governments write, the way organisations that deal in classified, compartmentalised information write, when they are trying to say something without fully saying it. And 3 years ago, I read my first SCP entry. I didn't sleep well that night. Not because the content disturbed me, though it did, but because of something far more specific. Something that took me several days to fully articulate, even to myself. It read like a real document, not like fiction pretending to be a document, like an actual, genuine, operationally produced containment report, written by someone who either had direct experience with classified procedural writing, or who had access to material that most people simply do not have access to. That distinction matters enormously, and tonight I'm going to walk you through exactly why. Act 1. The pattern recognition. Let me start with structure, because structure is where everything begins, and because the structure of the SCP database is, in my professional estimation, the single most anomalous thing about it. More anomalous than any of the phenomena it describes. When an individual writer, or even a small group of writers, creates a fictional universe, certain things happen organically. Inconsistencies emerge. Tonal shifts occur. The internal logic bends under the weight of creative freedom, because creative freedom is the whole point. Writers make choices. They change their minds. They develop their craft over time, and their earlier work no longer matches their later work. Their understanding of their own fictional world evolves, and that evolution leaves marks in the text. This is normal. This is human. Even the most rigorously constructed fictional worlds, the ones with dedicated wikis and obsessive fan communities spending years maintaining continuity, cross-referencing every detail, catching every error, even those worlds show the seams if you look closely enough. Because the seams are always there. They are the evidence of human authorship, and human authorship is never perfectly consistent across thousands of contributors and 2 decades of continuous production. The SCP database does not show those seams. I want to be very careful about how I say that, because it is the kind of statement that is easy to dismiss. People will say, the community enforces consistency. People will say, there is a wiki, there are moderators, there are style guides that contributors are required to follow. All of this is true. All of this is real. And none of it explains what I observed, because the consistency I'm describing is not the consistency of enforced style. It is not the consistency of writers following the same formatting rules. It is a deeper consistency, a consistency of operational logic, of procedural worldview, of the assumptions that underlie every entry at a level below what any style guide reaches. It is the consistency of an institution, not a community. And those are fundamentally different things. Across more than 6,000 entries written by hundreds of different authors, spanning nearly 2 decades of continuous publication, covering phenomena as wildly varied as sentient furniture and extra-dimensional corridors and objects that cause localized reality failure, the structural consistency is not merely impressive. It is, from an analytical standpoint, nearly impossible to explain through voluntary collaborative fiction alone. Every entry follows the same format: object class, special containment procedures, description, addenda. The headers are identical, the procedural language is standardized. The classification tiers, Safe, Euclid, Kita, and the more obscure designations beyond those, are applied with a coherence that suggests not community consensus, but institutional mandate. Think about what that actually means. Imagine asking 10,000 strangers, scattered across dozens of countries, speaking different native languages, working in different fields with wildly different life experiences. Imagine asking them all to spontaneously produce documents that conform to the exact same procedural format, use the exact same operational terminology, and maintain the exact same internal classification logic, without a central authority enforcing it at anything deeper than surface formatting, without any mechanism that could account for the consistency of operational assumption we actually observe. You cannot get that result from community momentum alone. Communities fracture, they evolve, they develop competing schools of thought. Subgroups emerge with different aesthetic priorities. The centre does not hold indefinitely in voluntary creative communities. It never has. In the history of collaborative fiction, in the history of internet forums, in the history of any community organised around shared creative production. The SCP database has internal debates about lore and tone, yes. There are factions within the community who prefer different stylistic approaches, who argue about the direction of the overarching narrative, who push for different tonal registers in new entries. That is all visible on the surface. But beneath those debates, beneath the aesthetic disagreements and the community politics, the underlying architecture remains almost eerily stable. That stability is the first anomaly. The second anomaly is language, and this is where my professional background becomes directly relevant. During my career, I was trained to identify what analysts call linguistic signatures, the unconscious stylistic fingerprints that organisations leave on their documents regardless of who is doing the individual writing. Every institution has them. The CIA writes differently than the NSA. The NSA writes differently than the Defence Intelligence Agency. Military intelligence writes differently than civilian intelligence, and both write differently than academic research institutions, which write differently than law enforcement agencies, which write differently than foreign intelligence services operating in translation. Within each organisation, across decades of documents and thousands of individual authors, certain patterns persist. Certain constructions recur. Certain ways of framing uncertainty, of hedging operational conclusions, of describing things that are not fully understood, of acknowledging the limits of current knowledge while maintaining institutional confidence in the protocols being applied, these become institutional habits. They are transmitted through training, through organisational culture, through the documents that new employees read when they are first learning how to write within the institution's framework. They self-perpetuate, and they are extremely difficult to fake because they operate below the level of conscious stylistic choice. The SCP database has a linguistic signature. It is not the signature of fiction. It is not the signature of creative writing, not even very disciplined, very technically accomplished creative writing. It is the signature of operational reporting, specifically the kind of operational reporting produced by organisations that deal in classified research and field documentation of phenomena that do not have established scientific explanations. I want to be precise here, because precision matters, and because imprecision is what allows claims like this to be dismissed. I'm not saying every word in every SCP entry was written by a government employee. I'm not saying the entire database was produced by a single institution. I am saying the foundational linguistic architecture of the database, the deep structural assumptions about how to frame anomalous phenomena, how to describe containment logic, how to handle the absence of complete understanding. These are not the patterns of fiction. These are the patterns of institutional documents produced under conditions of genuine operational uncertainty by people trained to document the unknown in specific ways. When I compared SCP entries to declassified CIA documents from the 1960s and 70s, particularly those related to Project MKultra and the Stargate project, and when I cross-referenced those comparisons against declassified Cold War research files from both American and Soviet programs, studying what they euphemistically called anomalous phenomena and non-standard physical effects, the linguistic overlap was statistically significant enough that I had to sit with it for a long time before I felt comfortable drawing any conclusions at all. The phrasing patterns, the specific constructions used to describe phenomena whose mechanism of action is unknown, the hedging language, the way certainty and uncertainty are calibrated against each other, the tone with which personnel failures, incidents where containment protocols did not function as intended, are documented. All of it lined up in ways that could not be explained as pastiche or research. A writer who had studied these documents extensively could reproduce some of these patterns consciously. But the unconscious patterns, the ones that operate below deliberate stylistic choice, the ones that emerge from training and institutional habit rather than intentional craft, those require something more than research. They require immersion. They require the kind of contact with institutional documentation that shapes how you think, not just how you write. Something in the SCP database reflects that kind of immersion, and that is the second anomaly. ACE2, the origin. The SCP database appeared on the internet in the late 2000s. The earliest entries, the ones that established the format, the tone, the foundational logic of the entire project, arrived in a small cluster, attributed to anonymous or pseudonymous authors on a fringe internet forum where the barriers to participation were essentially non-existent. Anyone could post. Anyone could contribute. The entries appeared, gathered attention, and the community began to build around them. The official history of the project describes this as an organic emergence, a handful of creative writers experimenting with a novel format, the clinical bureaucratic document as horror vehicle, word spreading through communities, contributors joining, the database growing through accumulated enthusiasm and shared creative investment. It is, on its face, a perfectly coherent account of how internet creative projects develop. The internet has produced many things this way, collaborative worlds built from the ground up through collective imagination. That history is not wrong exactly, but I believe it is incomplete in ways that matter enormously. Here is what I noticed about the earliest entries specifically, the ones that established the template for everything that came after. They are structurally the most sophisticated, not the most creative, not the most elaborately imagined, the most structurally sophisticated. The foundational entries display an understanding of institutional documentation conventions that does not read as the product of a creative writer researching how government documents look. It reads as the product of someone who has spent significant time inside institutional documentation systems, who has internalized the conventions at a level deeper than observation. The format didn't just borrow the aesthetic of official documents. It reproduced the underlying logic of official documents, the priorities, the assumptions, the specific ways that uncertainty is managed and recorded. You cannot reverse engineer that from reading examples. You acquire it through practice and immersion. The earliest entries are also linguistically the most consistent with the institutional documentation I described earlier, with the declassified research reports, the field documentation from classified programs, the internal communications of organizations that deal with phenomena outside the normal scientific framework. Later entries, added by community contributors over years of participation, show more variation. The foundational entries are remarkably uniform in their underlying assumptions, as if they came from the same source, or from a very small group of sources sharing a common institutional background. And there is the matter of the phenomena they describe. Several of the earliest SCP entries document anomalies that align, not in surface detail, but in the underlying nature of the phenomenon being described, with research programs and field reports that were, at the time those entries were written, still classified or only recently declassified in heavily redacted form. Programs that most internet users in the late 2000s had no awareness of. Programs that required specific knowledge to even know where to look for the declassified fragments that existed. The timing is not nothing. The early 2000s saw a significant wave of Freedom of Information Act requests producing declassified material from the 1970s and 80s. Much of it related to programs the government had, for decades, either denied entirely or refused to discuss. Remote viewing programs, research into materials with anomalous physical properties, psychological operations involving phenomena that resisted conventional scientific explanation. Programs with names that have since become moderately well known, Stargate, Gondola Wish, Grill Flame, and programs that remain even now almost entirely unknown to the general public. Some of that material became publicly available through the declassification process. Some of it filtered into academic research communities studying the history of Cold War intelligence programs. Some of it, I believe, found its way into the foundational architecture of the SCP database. Not wholesale, not as direct transcription. The identifying details were changed. The operational specifics were altered. The phenomena were described in ways that preserved their essential nature, while removing anything that would constitute a direct disclosure. But the underlying phenomena, the class of anomaly, the behavioural patterns, the specific ways they interacted with observers and with physical matter, those were preserved, translated into the language of fiction, embedded within a format designed to make them look invented, and released into a public forum where they would be catalogued, appreciated, and ultimately dismissed as creativity. This is the leak hypothesis, and I want to walk you through why I think it is the most coherent explanation for the patterns I observed. Consider the problem from the perspective of an organisation that has accumulated documentation of genuinely anomalous phenomena over several decades. Documentation that cannot be destroyed, because the phenomena are real and ongoing, and destroying the documentation does not make them less real. Documentation that cannot be released through normal channels, because the implications of official acknowledgement would be unmanageable. Documentation that cannot remain classified indefinitely, because classification systems are imperfect, because leaks happen, because the cost of indefinite suppression eventually exceeds the cost of controlled disclosure. What is the optimal solution? You fictionalize it. You take the real material, strip the operational specifics, alter the identifying details, embed it within a structure that the public will automatically categorize as creative writing, and release it into a forum where it will be celebrated as imaginative fiction. The information becomes available. It can be discussed, analysed, shared. Anyone who independently arrives at the real phenomena through their own research will find, if they look, that the information is already publicly accessible, already categorised as fiction, already dismissed by the mainstream, already contained by context. And the organisation responsible for the real documentation can, if ever asked, point to the database and say with complete technical accuracy that this material is publicly available and not classified. It is, after all, on a creative writing website. It is, after all, labelled fiction. The cover is real. The fiction is real. The only thing fictional about it is the label. The information is hidden in plain sight, contained not by classification but by context, not by vaults and security clearances but by the ordinary, human tendency to accept the frame in which information is presented and dismiss anything framed as fictional without subjecting it to the scrutiny we would apply to factual claims. That is the most elegant kind of concealment I have ever encountered in 11 years of working with classified material, and it is exactly the kind of concealment that an organisation with genuine operational sophistication and genuine access to the best psychological research on human cognition would design. Act 3. The classifications. Let me talk about the object classification system, because I think it is one of the most revealing elements of the entire database. Safe, Euclid, Keter, 3 primary tiers, and beyond those, a handful of classifications that appear rarely: Thaumiel, Apollyon, Neutralized, each with specific operational implications that the database defines with careful precision. On the surface, this looks like world building. A fictional organisation needs a fictional classification system. Writers invented one, and it became canon. Simple. Except the logic of the classification system is not fictional logic. Real classification systems, the kind used by intelligence agencies and military research programs to categorize sensitive material, are built around two primary axes: predictability and consequence. How well do we understand this thing's behaviour? And how dangerous is it if our understanding turns out to be insufficient? The SCP classification system maps onto those axes with a precision that is difficult to dismiss as coincidence. Safe does not mean harmless. It means contained and understood. The anomaly's behaviour is predictable enough that standard protocols are sufficient. Euclid means the behaviour is not fully understood. The anomaly may be cooperative or it may not, and the margin for error is real. Kita means active danger. The anomaly cannot be fully contained by current means, or its behaviour is so unpredictable that every containment protocol is provisional. This is not a writer's classification system. This is an analyst's classification system. The distinction between safe and Euclid in particular, the distinction between known and understood versus contained but opaque, is a distinction that matters enormously in real, operational environments and matters very little in fiction. Fiction doesn't need that granularity. Real containment does. And then there is the containment logic itself. This is the detail that bothered me most when I first began reading the database seriously. Every SCP entry spends far more time on containment procedures than it does on explanation. The containment procedures are specific, operational, and often elaborate. The explanations, the attempts to describe what the anomaly actually is, how it works, why it behaves as it does, are almost always incomplete. Provisional, hedged with language that indicates ongoing uncertainty. That is backwards from the perspective of fiction. A fiction writer designing an anomalous entity knows what the entity is. They invented it. They can explain it as fully as they like, because the explanation exists entirely within their imagination. There is no operational reason to limit the explanation. But there is a very clear operational reason to limit an explanation in a real document. If you do not fully understand what something is, you cannot fully explain it. You can only describe what you've observed, outline your containment protocols, and acknowledge that your understanding is incomplete. The SCP database is full of that acknowledgement, haunted by it, in some entries, and that haunting reads as genuine rather than performed. Act 4. The anomalies. I want to spend some time on specific entries. Not to identify any single entry as definitively real, I am not making that claim, but to illustrate the kinds of patterns that, when taken together, form something more than coincidence. First, the internal network. Many SCP entries reference each other. Personnel appear across multiple entries, locations recur. Events described in one entry have downstream consequences documented in another. This is again superficially explicable as world building. Collaborative fiction builds internal continuity. But when I mapped the cross-references, when I treated the SCP database the way I would treat a set of related intelligence reports, tracing the connections between entries, identifying the nodes of highest connectivity, looking for the structural skeleton beneath the individual documents, what emerged was not the loose organic web of collaborative fiction. What emerged was a hierarchy, a functional organisational chart. A chain of command that, in its broad outlines, mirrors the structures used by real compartmentalised research programs. Programs where individual researchers know their own work, but not the work of colleagues in adjacent compartments, where information flows upward through a chain of oversight, and where the full picture is available only to a very small number of people at the top. The SCP database has that shape, and it did not acquire it through any documented organisational effort. It emerged, or appeared to emerge, from thousands of individual contributions that somehow, inexplicably, built a coherent institutional architecture. Second, the impossible objects. Certain entries describe phenomena that are, within current scientific understanding, genuinely impossible. Spatial anomalies that fold physical space. Objects that exist in multiple states simultaneously. Entities that affect the perceptions of observers without detectable physical mechanism. locations where causality operates differently than it does in the surrounding environment. I'm not going to argue that these phenomena are real in any straightforward sense, but I'm going to note something about how they are described. They are described with the language of observed phenomena, not invented ones. The entries don't say these things are impossible and then explain why they exist anyway, the way a science fiction author would. The entries say these things are observed, that the observations are documented, and that the mechanism of operation remains unknown. The impossibility is treated as a practical problem rather than a conceptual flourish. That is how real anomalous data is handled. When researchers encounter data that contradicts existing models, they don't immediately rewrite the models. They document the observation, acknowledge the contradiction, and flag it for further investigation. The contradiction itself becomes the subject of study, not the starting point for a new theoretical framework. The SCP entries handle impossibility the way real researchers handle it. That specificity of approach, that methodological fingerprint, is not something you arrive at by writing fiction. It is something you arrive at by writing, or reading, or being trained in the conventions of real scientific documentation. And there are entries, a handful of them, scattered through the database, that describe phenomena strikingly similar to phenomena documented in declassified research programs that the United States government has acknowledged, at least partially investigating. Programs involving spatial anomalies, programs involving objects with properties that could not be explained by known physics, programs that were classified for decades and are still not fully disclosed. The similarity is close enough to be uncomfortable. Act 5. The real-world connection. Let me tell you about the sites. Within the SCP database, the Foundation operates a network of what are called secure containment sites, facilities built specifically to house anomalous objects and entities. These sites are described as remote, heavily secured, and compartmentalized. Access is layered. Different personnel have access to different areas of the same facility. The full scope of what any individual site contains is known only to the highest levels of administration. Individual researchers know their own work, their own wing, their own objects, and nothing else. This is a precise description of how real black site facilities operate, not a loose approximation drawn from spy novels or action films, not a dramatized version that captures the general idea. A precise, operationally accurate description of the logistical and security architecture that governs real classified facilities, facilities whose existence has been partially acknowledged through declassification processes, whose design principles have been documented in research on the Cold War intelligence apparatus, and whose operational logic is recognizable to anyone who has worked in or studied environments where compartmentalization is the primary security mechanism. The placement logic of SCP sites also mirrors real-world patterns, with an accuracy that I find difficult to dismiss as coincidence or research. Remote locations, geographic isolation that serves two purposes simultaneously, limiting access to the facility from outside and limiting the potential spread of containment failures to populated areas. Proximity to existing military or government infrastructure without direct co-location, close enough to access resources and personnel when needed, distant enough to maintain plausible separation. Locations chosen for their obscurity rather than their convenience, which means locations that impose real operational costs on the people who work there in exchange for security benefits that justify those costs. These are the same criteria that have governed the placement of real classified facilities for the better part of a century. They are not intuitive criteria. They are not the criteria that emerge naturally from trying to imagine what a secret facility might look like. They are the criteria that emerge from actually building secret facilities, from learning through operational experience what works and what doesn't, from a century of institutional knowledge about how to hide things in plain geography. A fiction writer designing a secret organization's headquarters might choose a mountain bunker, or an underground complex beneath a major city, or an island that doesn't appear on commercial maps. These are dramatic locations. They serve narrative purposes. They create atmosphere and a sense of consequence. The SCP site placement logic is none of these things. It is operational. It optimizes for containment rather than atmosphere. It makes the boring, practical choices that real facilities make rather than the exciting choices that fictional facilities make. And that distinction, that preference for operational accuracy over narrative impact, is one of the clearest signals throughout the database that something other than pure imagination is at work. The personnel structure is equally revealing, and in some ways more so. The Foundation's internal hierarchy, researchers, security personnel, administrative oversight, the O5 Council, mirrors the structure of real classified research programs with an accuracy that goes well beyond what world building requires. The relationship between scientific staff and security staff is not the relationship of Hollywood intelligence fiction, where researchers are nerds and security personnel are muscle, and the two groups tolerate each other uneasily. It is the relationship documented in real programs, a genuine tension between the imperative to understand phenomena and the imperative to control them, managed through a bureaucratic structure that gives each constituency specific authority and specific limitations. The way administrative authority overrides scientific authority in specific circumstances is drawn accurately. In real classified research programs, there are documented cases where scientific conclusions were overridden by operational security considerations, where the right answer to a scientific question was classified or suppressed because acting on it would compromise other priorities. The SCP database reflects this dynamic with a specificity that goes beyond what any outsider piecing together the structure from publicly available information would likely arrive at. And then there is the O5 Council, the oversight body whose membership is entirely anonymous, not just to the public, but to most Foundation personnel, including senior researchers and site directors. An oversight structure where the overseers are known to exist, but not known as individuals, where authority is exercised through a system that no individual can circumvent by targeting the people at the top, because no individual knows who those people are. In real compartmentalized programs, the identity of certain oversight personnel is known only to other oversight personnel. This is a genuine operational security measure with a specific purpose. It limits the ability of compromised individuals to target or expose the people responsible for maintaining the program. It is a design feature, not a dramatic flourish, and it is completely unnecessary from a narrative standpoint. A fiction writer inventing a secret organization doesn't need to build in this particular safeguard. It adds nothing to the story that a more conventional authority structure, with named leaders operating behind closed doors, wouldn't equally provide, unless the organization being described is not fictional, unless the oversight structure is being described accurately, because accuracy matters, because the structure exists, and because whoever is documenting it is trying to document it faithfully, even within the constraints of a format designed to make it look like creative writing. Ast 6. The Fiction Shield. Here is the central conclusion I arrived at after 3 years of analysis. And I want to be clear, I am not presenting this as certainty. I am not claiming absolute proof. I am a careful person, trained in the discipline of acknowledging uncertainty, and I will not overstate what the evidence supports. What I am presenting is the most coherent explanation I have been able to construct for the totality of the patterns I have documented. The SCP Foundation is not hidden, it is exposed. But it is exposed in a way that functions as concealment. That is, in fact, a far more effective form of concealment than any classification system could provide. By making the information publicly available within a framework that the world has categorically defined as fiction, whoever is responsible for the database has achieved something remarkable. The information can be accessed by anyone on Earth with an internet connection. It can be discussed, analysed, and shared without restriction, without triggering the responses that any attempt to formally classify and suppress it would provoke. And yet it is, for all practical purposes, inaccessible, because the context surrounding it ensures that the vast majority of people who encounter it will dismiss it without meaningful engagement. Think carefully about the psychological mechanism at work here, because this is the part that matters most. If you told someone, a thoughtful, intelligent, skeptical person, that a government organisation was secretly maintaining containment facilities for anomalous phenomena, objects and entities that defy known physics, biological impossibilities, spatial distortions, they might be deeply skeptical, but they would engage with the claim. They would ask for evidence. They might look into it. The claim would activate their critical faculties because it is framed as a factual assertion, and factual assertions invite evaluation. But if you told that same thoughtful, intelligent, skeptical person that a creative writing website had published 10,000 fictional stories about a secret organisation that maintains containment facilities for anomalous phenomena, they would nod and move on. There is nothing to evaluate. The frame has already done the work of dismissal before the content can be considered. It's fiction. Fictional claims don't require critical engagement. That's the whole social contract of fiction. You agree to be entertained without being asked to believe. This is what I mean by information camouflage at its most sophisticated level. The information is not hidden. The classification system that makes it safe to ignore is built into the context in which the information exists. No vault required, no security clearances required, no ongoing suppression effort required. The public does the work of containment for free, automatically, every single time someone reads an SCP entry and thinks, that's a clever piece of horror writing. The most dangerous place to put a real secret is not in a vault. It is in a library, labelled as a novel. Because people who break into vaults are looking for secrets. People who browse libraries are looking for stories, and a secret labelled as a story is invisible to anyone who isn't specifically looking for the things that distinguish real documents from fictional ones. The linguistic signatures, the operational logic, the structural fingerprints that persist beneath the surface of even the most carefully constructed camouflage. And there is a deeper layer to this, the layer I have come to think of as the saturation strategy, and which I believe is the most operationally sophisticated element of the entire architecture. By producing a very large volume of genuinely fictional content alongside whatever real material may exist in the database, the real and the fictional become indistinguishable from outside the system. Even an analyst who suspects that some of the material is genuine cannot easily identify which entries correspond to real phenomena and which are purely imaginative. The fictional entries serve as chaff, noise that overwhelms signal, and renders the signal inaccessible even to people who are specifically looking for it. This is not incidental. This is, I believe, deliberate and central to the strategy. If the database contained only the real material, only the genuine documented phenomena, it would be far more vulnerable. The consistency would be too complete, the operational accuracy too universal. Any sufficiently careful analyst would notice. By embedding the real entries within a much larger body of creative fiction, fiction produced by talented writers who have absorbed the format and can approximate the tone with reasonable fidelity, the whole becomes something far more defensible. A sea of stories, some of which are stories, and some of which are not. From outside you cannot tell the difference. That is the point. The fictional community produces the camouflage. The community does not know it is doing this. The writers contributing to the SCP database believe they are writing fiction. Most of them are. The fact that their creative work serves as cover for other material is something they are entirely unaware of, and their genuine creative investment, the passion, the craft, the community they have built, makes the camouflage more convincing than any manufactured fiction could be. Real creative communities have a texture, a vitality, a visible human enthusiasm that cannot be faked. That texture is part of what makes the whole enterprise so difficult to question. Act 7. The Final Discovery. There are redacted entries. Within the database, the publicly accessible, openly available, supposedly fictional database, there are entries that are partially or entirely redacted. Entries where key information has been removed, replaced with black bars or notation indicating that the content has been restricted. In a fictional universe, this is a narrative device. The redactions create atmosphere. They imply depth. They invite the reader to imagine what might be beneath them. But there is a specific subset of redacted entries that behaves differently from the rest. The redactions in these entries are not consistent with narrative effect. They don't redact the most dramatic details, the most frightening moments, the elements that would most effectively enhance the horror of the document as a piece of fiction. They redact operational details, specific protocols, precise measurements, location information, personnel identifiers that appear in other non-redacted entries in a way that suggests the redacted entries contain information that could, in combination with the unredacted material, produce a disclosure of something real. In other words, the redactions behave like operational security measures rather than creative choices. When I cross-referenced the redacted entries against the unredacted database, I found something I was not expecting. The missing information, the information implied by the surrounding content and the cross-references to other entries, in several cases maps onto phenomena that correspond to research programs that were, at the time the entries were written, either classified or only partially declassified. This is the detail that, more than any other, convinced me to take the leak hypothesis seriously. Because there is no reason for a fiction writer to operationally redact their own fictional document. There is no narrative reason. There is no creative reason. If you know what you are describing because you invented it, you have no operational reason to hide it from yourself or from your readers. You can describe it as fully as you like. The redaction adds nothing to the fiction that a less specific description wouldn't equally accomplish, unless the redaction is real, unless the information beneath it is real, unless the person or people responsible for those entries had access to material they needed to partially conceal even within the context of a database everyone was going to assume was fictional anyway. The redactions are the seam, the place where the fiction shield isn't quite thick enough, and then there is the final question, the one that took me the longest to sit with, because its implications are the most uncomfortable. If the SCP database is partially real, if some entries represent sanitized, fictionalized versions of genuine documented phenomena, then the entries we have access to are not the complete record. They are the edited record, the record that someone decided we could see. The anomalies described in the publicly available database are, by definition, the ones deemed safe enough to disclose, even in fictional form, the truly dangerous ones, the ones that would cause the most disruption, the ones that most fundamentally challenge the assumptions on which daily life is built. Those entries would not be in the public database. Those entries would be in a different database, one with actual classification, actual security, actual operational protocols designed to ensure that the information never reaches anyone who isn't cleared to receive it. What we have access to is the surface, the safe entries, the contained ones. Somewhere presumably there is a Kita-class section of the real archive that no one on the internet has ever read. Epilogue, the containment. You think the SCP Foundation is a story. That's the first layer of containment. I want to close tonight with something that took me a long time to understand fully, and that I think matters more than any of the specific patterns I've described. More than the linguistic signatures, more than the classification logic, more than the operational accuracy of the site placement and the personnel hierarchy. Because all of those things are evidence, and evidence is important, but evidence without a theory of purpose is just a collection of anomalies. The theory of purpose is this: if an organisation exists, a real organisation, operating in the real world, managing the containment of phenomena that the public is not equipped to understand or respond to productively, then that organisation's most powerful tool is not force. It is not classification. It is not technology, however advanced. It is psychology. Specifically, it is an understanding of the human mind's extraordinary capacity for motivated dismissal, for encountering things that don't fit the existing model of reality and finding ways to make them fit, or ways to stop looking at them altogether. The human mind is extraordinarily good at dismissing things that threaten its foundational assumptions. We don't need to be told to dismiss anomalous information. We do it automatically, reflexively, without conscious effort. We categorize it as fiction, as conspiracy theory, as the output of people who need a story to make the world feel more interesting, as the work of talented writers who have found a clever format for horror. We do this because the alternative, taking it seriously, following the evidence where it leads, genuinely entertaining the possibility that the world is larger and stranger than our current models can accommodate, is psychologically costly in ways that most people are not willing to pay. an organisation sophisticated enough to understand this at a deep operational level, to understand that disbelief is a containment mechanism, that the human tendency towards scepticism can be weaponized, that the best way to hide information from a skeptical population is to present it in a format they are already conditioned to dismiss. Such an organisation would not need aggressive classification programs to keep its secrets. It would only need to put the real information where everyone could see it, in a context that activated the dismissal reflex rather than the investigative one. The SCP Foundation, if it is real, operates globally. Its reach would extend across jurisdictions, beyond the authority of any single government, accountable to no electorate and no court. Its primary mission, the containment of anomalous phenomena, would require exactly the kind of resources and coordination that only a truly global institution could provide, and its primary containment measure for the most dangerous secret of all, the secret that the world contains things that the world does not believe in, would not be force or classification or surveillance. It would be this: what you're doing right now, reading about it, finding it interesting, and preparing to sleep. For most people listening to this tonight, the dismissal will come naturally. It may already be forming, the comfortable counter-narrative, the list of reasons why this is all very clever speculation, but ultimately just entertainment. That response is not a failure of intelligence. It is the system functioning exactly as designed. The containment protocol doesn't require you to consciously choose to dismiss the information. It works automatically, through this psychological architecture that makes the fiction label so effective. You don't decide not to believe, you simply don't believe, and the decision feels obvious, and you sleep. I have been careful tonight, measured. I have acknowledged uncertainty where it genuinely exists, and drawn conclusions only where the evidence has seemed to me to justify them. I have not made claims that outrun the analysis. I am not prone to drama. And yet, in the week since I first began assembling these observations into a coherent form, in the week since I began discussing them with a small number of people I trust, people with backgrounds similar to mine, people trained to notice the things I have described noticing, I have observed things, small things, individually unremarkable, the kind of things that, in any other context, I would attribute to coincidence or pattern seeking. But I'm not a person who attributes things to coincidence without careful consideration, and the pattern I am seeing is specific enough that I cannot bring myself to dismiss it. I will not describe these observations in detail, not because I am being dramatic and not because I want to create suspense, but because I have thought carefully about what responsible disclosure looks like in this situation, and I have concluded that specificity here would be a mistake. If I am wrong, if what I am observing is coincidence, then specificity makes me sound unhinged. If I am right, if what I am observing is what I think it might be, then specificity draws attention to the people I have been speaking with, and I'm not willing to do that. What I will say is this: if the SCP Foundation exists in any operational form, even attenuated, even partial, even bearing only a structural resemblance to what the database describes, then the act of analysing the database in the way I have analysed it, and the act of discussing those conclusions publicly in the way I am discussing them tonight, would constitute a specific type of event, an event that any sophisticated organisation would have protocols for, a category of occurrence that would have a name within their documentation system, a classification, a set of standard responses. I don't know what that name is. I don't know whether those protocols are being applied. I am not certain that I am anything more than a former analyst with a pattern recognition habit who has found a very compelling rabbit hole to fall into. The self-aware part of me, the part still governed by the skepticism my training gave me, holds all of this at arm's length and reminds me that the most likely explanation for any set of patterns is the mundane one. But I cannot fully unknow the things I have observed, and neither now can you. So as sleep comes for you tonight, as the room goes quiet and the thoughts begin to soften at the edges, and the boundary between the real and the imagined grows permeable in the way it does in the moments before sleep, I want to leave you with one last thought. The most effective containment doesn't look like containment. It looks like normalcy. It looks like bedtime. It looks like the comfortable certainty that you live in a world you understand, a world whose rules are the rules you learned, a world where the impossible things are in the stories and the real things are in the daylight. That certainty is not a conclusion you arrived at through investigation. It is an assumption you were born into, reinforced by every interaction with every institution and media source and social structure you have ever been part of. It was built for you before you were old enough to question it. And it is, if the SCP database is even partially real, the most powerful containment system ever devised.